Without the food supply, societies, they break down. And because of that, your news and your government won't tell you what's coming. They fear civil uprising. While you are locked in your homes, they do not want to provoke you by telling you that there is a food crisis coming. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization said, "We risk a looming food crisis unless measures are taken fast to keep global food supply chains alive and mitigate the pandemic's impacts across the food system." We are already seeing challenges in terms of the logistics involving movement of food from point A to point B, and the pandemic's impact on the livestock sector due to reduced access to animal feed and slaughterhouses' diminished capacity due to logistical constraints and labor shortages. The FAO said disruptions can be expected in April and May of 2020. We may be facing a man-made famine. And today, I want to give you the facts. The first thing I want to look at are grain crops. And I want to look specifically at what we have going on in the United States and then branch that out globally to include both grains and meats, and lastly, fruits and vegetables and dairy. In 2019, storms left millions of acres unseeded in the $51 billion U.S. corn market and put crops that were planted late at a greater risk for damage from severe weather during the growing season. Forecasts for even more rain sent U.S. corn futures to a 5-year high in 2019. And it artificially made the market look good, but in reality, few farmers benefited from the soaring prices because of the planting disruptions. So they had little to no crop to sell. There was massive flooding throughout the breadbasket. Flooding that lasted for months. The rains poured, the crops and the fields were flooded for months in the Midwest. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, nationwide 2019 was the smallest corn crop in 4 years. The U.S. government issued a $16 billion aid package to help farmers hurt by the reduced sales, specifically those to China. Trump then signed an additional $19 billion disaster relief bill that included more than $3 billion for expenses related to losses of crops, including those from not being able to plant the crops in the soil. This was all 2019. Reduced plantings means that there was less business for grain elevators. Some farmers who were not able to plant as much as they expected took an unusual step of actually canceling their contracts with grain elevators after the harvest. Those 2019 concerns bled into 2020 prior to us knowing the extent of the impact that this pandemic would have. Those 2019 concerns, cold weather into the planting season, wet weather, limited field access, restricted feed crop planting, meant that even in 2020, soil conditions in the corn and soybean belt of the United States were wetter than ideal and doubled down on 2019's losses. As of the end of March 2020, Russia's agricultural ministry wants to limit grain exports, including buckwheat, rice, and ready-to-eat oats for 3 months. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter. And based on the fact that their history includes famine, They are simply unwilling to risk their people's food supply for the rest of the world. Russia taking that action has prompted concern among traders that the measures that Russia took may not be temporary, that they may actually restrict imports longer than 3 months. Now, while the United States does not get grains from Russia, we do have a global economic market. So what Russia does, it impacts every nation in the Western world. But it's not just Russia. Kazakhstan, one of the world's biggest shippers of wheat flour, banned exports of wheat along with buckwheat, sugar, onions, carrots, cabbage, and potatoes. And that has the potential to affect companies around the world that rely on those supplies to make bread. Vietnam, the third biggest exporter of rice, has suspended all of its contracts. Serbia has stopped the flow of its sunflower oil and a list of other goods. China, the biggest rice grower and consumer on the planet, well, they're not even thinking about selling their rice. They have pledged to buy more of their own rice than ever before from its own harvest, even though the government already has massive stockpiles of rice and wheat. More than enough for 1 year. Listen to what I am saying. China has stockpiles of rice and wheat, enough to feed their entire population, the largest population of people in almost any country, for a year. And they are stockpiling more. Argentina's Buenos Aires Grains Exchange lowered its estimate of the country's 2019-2020 soybean crop from 54.5 million to 52 million tons. Wheat prices continue to rise as shoppers rush to stockpile pasta and flour. And in the UK, sales of dry pasta were up 55% and stores have been emptied entirely of pasta, noodles, bread, and rice. In Ireland, it's the same thing. North Africa is buying a ton of grain. Stocks are moving from France to Algeria, according to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Thai rice prices went up 14% as of the beginning of this month. And France is rationing baguettes. U.S. plantings of winter wheat are at their lowest point in more than 100 years because the fields have been flooded. And farmers planted 25% less soft red winter wheat in Illinois, and the crops are being traded at 25% higher of a cost. In Michigan, planting was 7% less. According to the USDA, about 70% of this season's wheat crop has been marketed. What that means is that it's sold. It's already sold. 70%, which only leaves 30% that is actually open for sale. Malaysia, the largest palm oil producing state of Sabah, ordered the closure of its palm oil plantations in 3 districts. But it's not just the grains. I wanted to talk about those first because those are staple products. But it's also meat and produce and dairy. Many of the nation's largest farms are struggling with another effect of this pandemic. They're being forced to destroy tens of millions of pounds of fresh food that they can't sell. The closing of restaurants and hotels and schools has put some farmers in a position where they have no buyers for more than half of their crops. And even if retailers see spikes in food sales to American consumers because we're eating almost every meal at home as we are being forced to stay in our houses, those increases are not enough to absorb all of the perishable food that was planted weeks ago and meant to go to schools and businesses. There are many farmers that say they have tried to donate part of the surplus food to food banks and Meals on Wheels programs because they're overwhelmed, obviously, with demand as people lose their jobs and run through their money and are hungry. But there's only so much perishable food that these charities, who don't have unlimited refrigerator space, and volunteers can take. African swine fever wiped out half of China's pigs. And they are the world's largest pork consumer. So U.S. pork producers may be exporting more pork to China to take advantage of demand, but that stands the possibility of crimping the supplies of pork bellies, ham, and related products for U.S. consumers in 2020. Now, you're thinking, I don't eat pork, right? Some of you. How does this affect me? Well, let me paint the whole picture. With restaurants, hotels, and schools closed, many of the nation's largest farms are destroying millions of pounds of fresh goods that they can no longer sell. In Wisconsin and Ohio, farmers are dumping thousands of gallons of fresh milk into lagoons and manure pits. The nation's largest dairy cooperative, Dairy Farmers of America, estimates that farmers are dumping as many as 3.7 million gallons of milk per day. A single chicken processor, just one chicken processor, Sanderson Farms, is smashing 750,000 unhatched eggs every week. And then they're sending them to a rendering plant so they can be turned into pet food. They've even considered euthanizing their chickens because they're not willing to sell them at an unprofitable rate. What we are looking at here is a man-made famine. Man-made by the lockdown for this pandemic. Man-made because even if the food is there, the food we do have, nobody's willing to raise and rear these things for free. And then there are very real shortages that our economy was already impacted with. There's an Idaho farmer that dug up huge ditches to bury 1 million pounds of his own onions. And in South Florida, a region that supplies much of the eastern half of the United States, so listen up, those of you who live on the east, with produce, there are tractors crisscrossing bean and cabbage fields, plowing perfectly ripe vegetables back into the soil. Let me repeat that. In South Florida, they are destroying their own crops and turning them into fertilizer. Egg sales are up 150% more than normal, and egg prices are going up right along with that. But production remains the same, even though we see egg shortages. Why? Because number one, chickens can only lay 1 egg a day. And number two, they're living animals, and it takes time to build up flock size. So the cheapest protein we have available, eggs, is not really available because demand has become so high and they simply can't force the chickens to lay more eggs, and they can't mature chickens fast enough to keep up with the demand. Isn't it ironic? And as far as feed chickens go, they're smashing the eggs because they will not sell chicken for free. JBS, which is a major manufacturer of many types of meats, is having tons of problems. Their facility in Souderton, Pennsylvania, the largest beef facility east of Chicago, is temporarily suspended its production. The JBS beef plant in Grand Island, Nebraska, also a Sanderson Farms poultry plant in Macomb, Mississippi, and a third plant have also suspended production, Smithfee. Tyson Foods announced on April 6th that it suspended production at a pork plant in Columbus Junction, Iowa. And around 800 workers at another JPS plant in Greenlee, Colorado, they just called off work, 800 people on March 30th, as part of a mass no-show. Protectionist measures by national governments during this pandemic could provoke food shortages around the world. What am I saying to you? As you think about your survival, I want you to realize that staples, such as wheat and rice, are likely to be higher in demand. And I want you to consider that consumers, you and I, are going to be competing with food manufacturers for the limited global supply of grains. There's also consumer competition for a limited stock because demand for food will not change much, but people are going to be switching from more luxury foods to cheaper standard foods. As people are forced to stay home, they have to switch from consuming prepared foods outside the home to preparing foods inside the home. And on top of that, countries are starting to hoard food. We are already seeing rationing of food and supplies in our stores here in America. This video is to tell you to prepare. Because between those people who are panicking now, they will panic more when all of this becomes more exasperated. And they're buying through the stores and buying on the market of next year's harvest. This means prices are going to go up, and as prices go up, policymakers will panic more as well. It's a double-edged sword. And higher grocery bills can have major ramifications. The cost of bread has a long history of kickstarting unrest and political instability. During the food price spikes of 2011 and 2008, there were food riots in more than 30 nations. Without the food supply, societies, they break down. And because of that, your news and your government won't tell you what's coming. They fear civil uprising. While you are locked in your homes, they do not want to provoke you by telling you that there is a food crisis coming. Now, I cannot guarantee this will happen, and I hope it doesn't. But what I did do today is give you the facts surrounding some of the major things that are going on globally and nationally with our food supply chain. And I would strongly encourage you to prepare, because the worst thing that can happen is that you won't have to buy some of these things for a while. And that is a far less price to pay than being in a situation where you and your family are hungry. Don't think they're going to tell you the truth. Their goal above everything else is to keep political and social control and security. And being honest and telling you that the stores are empty for a reason, it won't do that. They will watch you go hungry first. Think about what they did at the beginning of this pandemic. They told you not to stock up. And then all of a sudden, they were telling everybody to be ready to have at least 2 to 4 weeks worth of food in their house, and there was a run on the stores. I warned you then, weeks before it happened, and I'm warning you now. Prepare. I'll talk to you guys later.
You know, the babies, the future, the black babies, that's what it's all about. You know, they talk about Black Lives Matter. I'm gonna tell you like this, man. The black youth is what matters the most. And that's what we gotta do, because that youth is what's gonna be the ones to liberate us. You know, we gotta hear from them. So as we give it to them, and we give this, they use these tools to build with, this is our future right here. I mean, it's the biggest investment you can make. Science Institute. You gotta invest. And there's African Senate institutes all over the country. You gotta find where they at. You gotta support those people, because there's people out here that actually have institutions and that are actually in the community doing things. You know, it's not about what we're gonna do and how we're gonna do it. You have people doing it. So it's happening. You just gotta get with the brothers, help the brothers, support the future, support yourself. That's what we're doing.